Trước khi bắt đầu viết câu chuyện, tôi cần lập dàn ý chi tiết 8 phần cho câu chuyện mới với tiêu đề For my 18th birthday, my family handed me an eviction notice from my own house. We need it more. Giới thiệu nhân vật chính Jordan 18 tuổi, mô tả sự háo hức về buổi tiệc sinh nhật 18 tuổi, nhắc đến ngôi nhà được thừa kế từ người bà, ông tài sản hợp pháp của Jordan, mối quan hệ căng thẳng với gia đình kể anh chị em kể, cảm giác bất an trước buổi tiệc, sốc khi nhận được giấy thông báo đuổi khỏi nhà như quà sinh nhật. Câu nói của mẹ kế, chúng tôi cần ngôi nhà hơn cháu. Kêu gọi hành động cho người xem, Jordan mất cả cha lẫn mẹ trong tai nạn từ nhỏ. Được bà ngoại nuôi dưỡng trong ngôi nhà hiện tại, mối quan hệ thân thiết với bà ngoại người để dạy cô anh về giá trị gia đình. Bà ngoại qua đời vì bệnh khi Jordan 16 tuổi, di chúc để lại ngôi nhà cho Jordan khi đủ 18 tuổi. Sau khi bà mất, người chú Di đừng làm người giám hộ. Người chú Di nhanh chóng tái hôn với người mới. Gia đình kẻ vợ, chồng mới và con riêng chuyển vào nhà. Dần dần Jordan bị đối xử như người ngoài trong chính ngôi nhà của mình. Những khó khăn trong việc hòa nhập với gia đình mới, cố gắng tìm cách sống chung hòa thuận nhưng luôn bị từ chối. Mong đợi sinh nhật 18 tuổi để chính thức sở hữu ngôi nhà theo di chúc. Những cuộc họp gia đình bí mật mà Jordan không được tham gia. Thái độ thay đổi của người chú Di và gia đình kể. Bắt gặp họ lục lọi giấy tờ nhà di chúc, nghe lượm cuộc nói chuyện với luật sư về quyền sở hữu ngôi nhà. Các hành vi kỳ lạ đồ đạc phòng của Jordan thảo luận về việc cải tạo. Cảm giác bất an ngày càng tăng, cố gắng tìm hiểu thông tin từ bạn bè của gia đình, chuẩn bị cho sinh nhật 18 tuổi với hy vọng mọi thứ sẽ thay đổi tốt đẹp. Niềm tin rằng khi có quyền sở hữu ngôi nhà Jordan sẽ được tôn trọng hơn, kế hoạch cho tương lai với ngôi nhà đại học, công việc độc lập tài chính, mô tả buổi sáng sinh nhật đầy hy vọng, buổi tiệc sinh nhật căng thẳng với những nụ cười giả tạo, khoảnh khắc trao quà giấy thông báo đuổi khỏi nhà. Giải thích của gia đình họ đã tìm cách hợp thức hóa việc lấy ngôi nhà, phát hiện họ đã làm giả giấy tờ, sửa đổi di chúc. Sự phản bội của người chú Di đáng tin cậy, nỗi đau khi biết kế hoạch này đã được chuẩn bị từ lâu, tranh cãi đau đớn về quyền sở hữu ngôi nhà, cảm giác bị phản bội, bị ruộng bỏ bởi người thân duy nhất còn lại. Jordan bị đuổi ra khỏi nhà ngay trong đêm sinh nhật, cú sốc và trạng thái vô định không biết đi đâu về đâu. Đêm đầu tiên phải ngủ ở nhà bạn, những ngày lang thang không nơi nương tựa, trạng thái trầm cảm tuyệt vọng và cô đơn, phải bỏ do việc học, công việc vì không có nơi ở ổn định, cố gắng tìm việc làm để sinh tồn, khó khăn khi cố gắng tiếp cận luật sư mà không có tiền, nỗi đau khi thấy gia đình kẻ sửa sang, cải tạo ngôi nhà, phát hiện thêm nhiều lừa dối họ đã lên kế hoạch từ khi bà ngoại còn sống, cảm giác hoàn toàn bị phản bội và bỏ rơi, điểm thấp nhất suy nghĩ tiêu cực về giá trị bản thân và tương lai. Gặp gỡ một luật sư trẻ đồng ý giúp đỡ với chi phí thấp, tìm kiếm bằng chứng về di chúc gốc và quyền sở hữu thực sự. Liên hệ với bạn cũ của bà ngoại để tìm thông tin, khám phá bản di chúc gốc được cất giữ bởi người bạn tin cậy của bà. Thu thập bằng chứng về việc giả mạo giấy tờ của gia đình kể. Làm việc nhiều công việc để trang trải chi phí pháp lý, tìm kiếm sự hỗ trợ từ cộng đồng và bạn bè, xây dựng chiến lược pháp lý vững chắc. Sự giúp đỡ bất ngờ từ hàng xóm cũ để chứng kiến mọi chuyện. Tình bạn mới được xây dựng trong giai đoạn khó khăn. Dần lấy lại niềm tin vào bản thân và khả năng đấu tranh. Ngày ra tòa đầy căng thẳng, đối mặt với gia đình kể và sự phản bội của họ. Trình bày bằng chứng về di chúc thật và quyền sở hữu hợp pháp. Những lời khai của hàng xóm và bạn bè bà ngoại. Phản ứng bất ngờ của tòa án với bằng chứng giả mạo. Khoảnh khắc gia đình kể bắt đầu đổ lỗi cho nhau. Phán quyết của tòa Jordan giành lại quyền sở hữu ngôi nhà. Cảm xúc lẫn lộn khi thắng kiện nhưng mất đi gia đình. Quá trình pháp lý để đuổi gia đình kể ra khỏi nhà. Ngày Jordan chính thức lấy lại ngôi nhà với cảm xúc phức tạp. Đối mặt cuối cùng với người chú Di. Giờ các ngươi hiểu cảm giác bị đuổi khỏi nhà là thế nào rồi đấy. Jordan dần xây dựng lại cuộc sống trong ngôi nhà của mình. Quá trình chữa lành vết thương tinh thần từ sự phản bội. Trở lại trường học, công việc với quyết tâm mới. Tìm kiếm ý nghĩa mới cho khái niệm gia đình. Xây dựng một gia đình từ bạn bè và người hỗ trợ. Những thay đổi tích cực trong ngôi nhà để xóa bỏ ký ức đau buồn. Bắt đầu một quỹ hỗ trợ cho những người trẻ gặp tình huống tương tự. Học cách tha thứ không phải vì họ, mà vì bản thân Jordan. Nhận ra giá trị thực sự của ngôi nhà không chỉ là tài sản vật chất, mà còn là di sản tinh thần, xây dựng tương lai tốt đẹp hơn từ nghịch cảnh. Bài học sâu sắc về tình yêu thương, lòng tin và giá trị thực sự của nhà. Lời cảm ơn và kêu gọi hành động comment, subscribe, share. Bây giờ tôi sẽ viết câu chuyện hoàn chỉnh dựa trên dàn ý này. I'm Jordan 18 today, and instead of celebrating adulthood with cake and presents, I'm holding an eviction notice from my own house. The home my grandmother left me in her will, the only place I've ever felt safe. When my parents died, she raised me here, promising it would always be mine. After she passed 2 years ago, my uncle and his new wife moved in as my guardians. They've been planning this moment, waiting for my birthday to reveal their true intentions. We need the house more than you do, my stepmother said coldly, handing me the papers. Before I continue my story, Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt betrayed by those meant to protect you. I was only 6 years old when my parents died in a car accident on their way home from their anniversary dinner. The memory is hazy now, fragments of police officers at the door, and my grandmother holding me as I sobbed without fully understanding what had happened. My grandmother, Margaret Fuller, was a retired school teacher who had already lost her husband years earlier. At 65, she took on raising me without hesitation. "Family takes care of family," she would say whenever I apologized for being a burden. "Your mother was my only child, and you are my heart continuing to beat in this world." Our home was a charming 2-story craftsman on a quiet street in Portland. It wasn't extravagant, but held decades of family history. My grandmother had purchased it with my grandfather in the 70s, and its walls had witnessed generations of fuller family memories. My mother had grown up in that house, and now so would I. Under my grandmother's care, I thrived despite the tragedy. She was strict but loving, emphasizing education, honesty, and kindness above all else. Every night she would sit on the edge of my bed and tell me stories about my mother as a child, keeping her memory alive through these shared moments. "Your mother had your same stubborn streak," she would say with a soft smile. "Once she decided something was right, there was no changing her mind. You have that same fire in your eyes." As I grew older, my grandmother became not just my caretaker, but my closest friend. We gardened together in the backyard. She taught me to bake her famous apple pie, and we spent rainy afternoons working through her collection of classic novels. The house became our sanctuary, filled with photographs, handmade quilts, and furniture that had been passed down through generations. When I turned 14, my grandmother sat me down for a serious conversation about the future. Always practical, she wanted me to understand what would happen as she aged. "Jordan, I need you to know something important," she said, holding my hands in hers. "This house is your inheritance. I've arranged everything with my lawyer. When I'm gone, the house will be held in trust for you until your 18th birthday, when it will legally become yours." I protested, not wanting to discuss her eventual passing, but she insisted. "These are things we must talk about openly. My brother, your Uncle Stephen, will be your guardian if anything happens before you're of age. But the house is yours always. It's the promise I made to your mother." 2 years later, when I was 16, my grandmother was diagnosed with aggressive pancreatic cancer. Within 6 months, she was gone. Those final months were a blur of hospital visits, hospice care, and trying to memorize everything about her before she left me. On her final night, she made me promise to finish my education and keep the house in the family. "This is your anchor in the world," she whispered. "No matter what happens, you'll always have a home here." After the funeral, Uncle Stephen moved in as planned. I barely knew him, as he had lived on the opposite coast for most of my life, visiting only occasionally for holidays. He was my grandmother's younger brother, 20 years her junior, and had always seemed uncomfortable around children. At first he maintained a respectful distance, setting up in the guest room, and assuring me that this arrangement was temporary until I reached adulthood. "Your grandmother was very clear about her wishes," he said during those first awkward days of cohabitation. "I'm just here to make sure you finish school and transition to independence safely." Everything changed when 3 months later he announced he had remarried. His new wife, Diane, was a widow with 2 teenage children, Amanda and Tyler. Without consulting me, Uncle Stephen informed me they would all be moving into the house. "It makes financial sense," he explained. "Why maintain 2 households when we can all live comfortably here? This place has plenty of room." Overnight, my quiet home with its predictable routines transformed into a chaotic household dominated by strangers. Diane immediately began rearranging furniture, taking down family photos, and replacing them with her own family's images. Her children, both older than me, claimed the best spaces in the house as their territories. "You're lucky we're even keeping you in the same bedroom," Amanda commented when I objected to her repainting the living room. "Most kids would be shipped off to boarding school after losing their parents." Despite my grandmother's clear intentions for the house, I increasingly felt like an unwelcome guest. Family dinners became tense affairs where I was often ignored or spoken to condescendingly. Uncle Stephen, once awkward but respectful, began deferring to Diane in all matters, including decisions about my daily life and education. "Jordan needs to understand that this is a family home, now not just hers," Diane would say with Uncle Stephen nodding in agreement. "We all need to make adjustments." My adjustment apparently included giving up access to spaces that had always been mine, following new household rules that seemed designed to inconvenience me, and watching family heirlooms being moved to the attic to make room for Diane's possessions. I tried desperately to maintain connections to my grandmother in small ways, keeping her books in my room, tending her garden on weekends, and quietly continuing traditions she had started. But even these small comforts were gradually whittled away. "The garden is taking up too much space. We're putting in a patio," Diane announced one Saturday as I was weeding the flower beds. "Those old books are collecting dust and taking up space. We should donate them," she suggested, another time eyeing my grandmother's collection critically. Through it all, I clung to the knowledge that when I turned 18, the house would legally become mine. I fantasized about the day I could reclaim my home and perhaps politely ask them to find other accommodations. This thought sustained me through increasingly difficult months as the household dynamic grew more strained. As my 18th birthday approached, I began researching colleges, planning to use part of the house as a rental to support myself through school. I dreamed of restoring the house to its former warmth, bringing back the family photos and treasured objects that had been packed away. "Just a few more months," I would whisper to myself at night. "Then I can make this a home again." Little did I know that Uncle Stephen and Diane had entirely different plans that would shatter any illusion that I had ever truly belonged in their version of a family. 6 months before my 18th birthday, I began noticing subtle changes in the household atmosphere. Uncle Stephen and Diane held frequent hushed conversations that abruptly ended when I entered the room. Their children, Amanda and Tyler, occasionally smirked at me with a new sense of superiority that made my skin crawl. Something was happening behind the scenes, but I couldn't piece it together. The first concrete sign came when I returned home early from school one day and found Uncle Stephen in my grandmother's old home office, a room that had been kept locked since her passing. Through the partially open door, I could see him rifling through her filing cabinet, pulling out documents and examining them closely. "What are you looking for?" I asked, startling him. He jumped slightly, quickly shutting the drawer. "Just organizing some old paperwork. Nothing important." His voice was casual, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine. "Shouldn't you be at school?" "Early release day," I explained, watching as he tucked a folder under his arm. "Are those my grandmother's papers?" "Just old bills and things. I'm clearing space for Diane's craft supplies." He brushed past me, taking the documents with him before I could see what they contained. That evening, I overheard a phone conversation between Uncle Stephen and someone he referred to as counselor. Standing silently and in the hallway, I caught fragments that sent a chill through me. "Yes, the original document is problematic. No, she has no idea. We need to establish continuous occupancy and financial contribution. The minor has never contributed to household expenses. Yes, under state law, we might have a case for..." His voice dropped too low for me to hear the conclusion. Over the next few weeks, strangers began visiting our home when I was supposedly at school. I learned about these visits only because our neighbour, Mrs. Lawson, mentioned them casually. "Your family must be planning some big changes," she said over the fence one Saturday. "That real estate appraiser has been by twice now, and I saw a contractor taking measurements last week." "Real estate appraiser?" I questioned, feeling my stomach knot. "I didn't know about that." Mrs. Lawson looked uncomfortable. "Oh, I assumed you knew. A woman with a clipboard taking photos of the exterior and making notes. Your uncle introduced her as an appraiser when I asked." That night at dinner, I casually mentioned house renovations, watching their reactions carefully. "Are we planning to remodel something?" Mrs. Lawson mentioned seeing contractors. An uncomfortable silence fell over the table before Diane laughed too brightly. "Just getting some estimates for updating the kitchen. Nothing definite yet." But I noticed the quick glance between her and Uncle Stephen, the way Amanda suddenly became very interested in her food. They were lying, but about what exactly? 3 months before my birthday, I came home to find someone measuring my bedroom while Diane directed them. "What's going on?" I asked from the doorway. "Just seeing if this space would work as a home office," Diane replied smoothly. "The light is so much better in here." "But this is my room," I said, confusion evident in my voice. "For now," she replied with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing to worry about just yet." That night, I searched my grandmother's office while everyone was sleeping. Most of the important documents were gone, but behind a loose baseboard my grandmother had once shown me, I found a small envelope containing a letter addressed to me in her handwriting for Jordan in case of disputes. Inside was a brief note explaining that her lawyer, Mr. Harrington, held copies of all important documents, including her will and the house deed. She had apparently anticipated potential problems, though probably not from her own brother. The next day, I skipped lunch period and used the school phone to call Mr. Harrington's office, only to be told he had retired 2 years ago, shortly after my grandmother's death. His practice had been taken over by a new firm, and they had no record of any documents relating to Margaret Fuller or Jordan Fuller. "That's impossible," I insisted. "He was her lawyer for decades. He handled her will." "I'm sorry," the receptionist replied. "We have no files under those names. Perhaps they were transferred elsewhere with client permission." My sense of foreboding grew as my birthday approached. I confided in my closest friend Taylor, who had known my grandmother and understood the situation. "Something's not right," I told her. "They're planning something, and I think it involves the house." "Can you contact any of your grandmother's friends?" Taylor suggested. "Someone else who might know about her will or have copies of documents." I spent the next weeks trying to track down my grandmother's old friends and colleagues, most of whom had lost touch after her death. The few I reached had limited information, expressing surprise that Uncle Stephen would contest anything, since Margaret was always so clear about her wishes. 2 weeks before my birthday, I overheard Diane on the phone discussing what sounded like party arrangements. Despite everything, a small spark of hope ignited. Perhaps I had misinterpreted the strange behavior. Maybe they were planning a surprise birthday celebration, not some scheme to undermine my inheritance. This hope sustained me through the increasingly tense household atmosphere. I noticed my possessions being subtly moved, condensed, as though someone was assessing how much space they occupied. Tyler began making comments about how his college applications were going well, and how convenient it would be to live at home during his studies. The commute to Portland University would be so easy from here, he mentioned casually over breakfast. I could take over the upstairs bedroom. It has the best study space. My bedroom. He was talking about my bedroom. The weekend before my birthday, Uncle Stephen and Diane hosted a dinner with a man introduced as our family attorney, Harold Winters. Throughout the meal, he asked seemingly innocent questions about how long I had lived in the house, whether I had contributed financially to its upkeep, and what my plans were after high school. "Just curious about this bright young woman's future," he explained when I questioned the purpose of his interest. That night, I couldn't sleep. Everything pointed to some plan involving the house, but I couldn't understand how they could possibly circumvent my grandmother's clear wishes. The house was mine, legally designated to transfer to me on my 18th birthday. How could they change that? The night before my birthday, I found myself sitting in the backyard garden, one of the few spaces that still held my grandmother's essence. The roses she had planted still bloomed, somehow surviving Diane's neglect. "What are they planning, Grandma?" I whispered to the stars. What should I do? The garden offered no answers, but sitting there, I made a promise to myself and to my grandmother's memory. Whatever happened tomorrow, I would fight for what was rightfully mine. This house wasn't just property, it was my heritage, my history, and my home. I would not surrender it without a battle. As I finally drifted to sleep that night, I had no idea just how cruel their plan would be, or that they would choose my birthday itself to deliver the blow that would leave me homeless and alone. My 18th birthday dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day that seemed to promise new beginnings. I woke with a mixture of excitement and apprehension, knowing that today I officially became an adult with all its freedoms and responsibilities. More importantly, today the house legally became mine, according to my grandmother's will. I dressed carefully in an outfit my grandmother had bought me for my last birthday. With her a simple blue dress, she said, brought out my eyes. It felt like having a piece of her with me on this important day. When I came downstairs, I was surprised to find the kitchen empty, no sign of the usual morning rush of activity. A note on the counter explained, "At work early, birthday dinner planned for 6 p.m. Be home on time, dress nicely." The empty house felt peaceful, a rare occurrence since Uncle Stephen's family had moved in. I made myself breakfast and sat at the kitchen table, allowing myself to imagine how different things would be now. Perhaps I could suggest a reasonable timeline for them to find their own place. I didn't want to be cruel, just reclaim what was rightfully mine. The day passed slowly. I received birthday messages from friends, a card from Mrs. Lawson next door, and even a call from one of my grandmother's old colleagues. Each connection reminded me that despite Uncle Stephen and Diane's attempts to isolate me, I wasn't entirely alone in the world. As evening approached, I grew increasingly nervous. Something about the planned dinner felt ominous, despite my attempts to stay positive. When I returned to my room to change, I found a gift box on my bed with a card reading, "Happy 18th birthday," in Diane's handwriting. Inside was a new dress, sleek and black, clearly expensive. The gesture was so unexpected that it momentarily rekindled my hope that I had misinterpreted their recent behavior. By 6 o'clock, the house had been transformed. The dining room table was set with the good china that usually remained locked in the cabinet. Flowers adorned the center of the table, candles were lit, and the aroma of a roast filled the house. Uncle Stephen, Diane, Amanda, and Tyler were already seated when I entered, all dressed formally and wearing expressions I couldn't quite read. "Happy birthday, Jordan?" Uncle Stephen stood to pull out my chair. "The woman of the hour has arrived." Diane raised her glass. "To adulthood, may you face it with wisdom and grace." The toast felt oddly formal, almost like a ceremony. Throughout the elaborate meal, conversation remained superficial, focusing on inconsequential topics, while avoiding any mention of my inheritance or future plans. The tension beneath the forced pleasantries was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. After dessert, a cake decorated with "Happy 18th birthday, Jordan," in elaborate script, Uncle Stephen cleared his throat and exchanged a meaningful glance with Diane. "Jordan, now that you've reached this milestone, there are some important matters we need to discuss." He nodded to Diane, who reached into a folder beside her chair and extracted an official-looking document. "We have a birthday gift for you," she said, sliding the paper across the table. "Something that will help you begin your independent life." Confused but hopeful, I reached for what I assumed might be a deed confirmation, or perhaps information about a trust fund my grandmother had established. Instead, I found myself staring at an eviction notice, legally requiring me to vacate the premises within 30 days. "What is this?" My voice sounded distant, as though someone else was speaking. "This is my house. My grandmother left it to me." Uncle Stephen's expression was a practiced mix of regret and firmness. "There's been a misunderstanding about that. Your grandmother's intentions weren't properly documented, I'm afraid." "That's not true," I protested, my hands beginning to shake. "She had a will. Mr. Harrington handled everything. The will was never properly executed," Diane interjected smoothly. "And as your grandmother's closest living relative, Stephen inherited the property by default. Our lawyer has confirmed this." "We've been generous," Uncle Stephen continued his tone, suggesting I should be grateful. "Legally, we could have addressed this when you were 16, but we wanted you to finish high school without disruption." I stared at them in disbelief as the full reality of their betrayal crashed over me. "You planned this all along. From the moment Grandma died, you were planning to steal my house." "We're not stealing anything." Diane's voice hardened. "This house legally belongs to Stephen. We're simply reclaiming what's rightfully ours." "We need the house more than you do, Jordan," Uncle Stephen said, dropping all pretense of regret. "Amanda and Tyler are starting college. We need the space and the financial security this property provides." "But where am I supposed to go?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. Amanda smirked across the table. "Maybe you should have made some plans instead of assuming you'd get a free house." 30 days is generous, Diane added. "It gives you time to find an apartment and get established. Many young adults start with much less." I looked from face to face around the table, searching for any sign of compassion or doubt. There was none, only calculated determination, and the satisfaction of a long-planned scheme finally executed. "My grandmother would be ashamed of you," I said finally, standing from the table. "All of you." "Your grandmother isn't here," Uncle Stephen replied coldly, "and emotional appeals won't change the legal reality." I clutched the eviction notice and left the dining room, their voices continuing the conversation as if my departure was insignificant. In my bedroom, I frantically searched for any documents that might help me, any evidence of my grandmother's true wishes. Most of my important papers had mysteriously gone missing over the past months, I now realized. Later that night, as I lay awake trying to process what had happened, Diane knocked on my door. "We expect you to handle this maturely," she said without preamble. "No dramatics, no involving the neighbors in family business." "Family business," I repeated incredulously. "You're throwing me out of my own home on my 18th birthday and calling it family business. The reality is that you are never going to be part of this family permanently," she stated with brutal honesty. "Stephen fulfilled his obligation as your guardian. That obligation ended today. Now it's time for you to make your own way as adults do." As she closed the door, the truth hit me with devastating clarity. I was never truly part of their family. I had been a temporary inconvenience, an obligation to be endured until they could legally discard me and claim what they had wanted all along my grandmother's house. On what should have been one of the happiest days of my life, I found myself clutching an eviction notice, realizing I was now both an adult and homeless, betrayed by the only family I had left. The days following my birthday passed in a nightmarish blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding interaction with the family that had so thoroughly betrayed me. When our paths crossed unavoidably, they treated me with a strange mix of condescension and impatience, as though I was being unreasonable for being upset about losing my home. "Everyone has to leave the nest eventually," Diane remarked when she found me staring blankly at college brochures I could no longer afford to consider. "This is just your time." I had exactly 28 days left to figure out where I would go and how I would survive. The magnitude of this betrayal left me alternating between paralyzing despair and burning rage. At night, I would silently sob into my pillow, terrified of the uncertain future ahead. During the day, I mechanically searched apartment listings I couldn't afford and job postings I wasn't qualified for. 3 days after my birthday, I reached out to Taylor in desperation. Her family had always been kind to me, and I had nowhere else to turn. "They did what?" Taylor's voice rose in disbelief when I explained the situation over the phone. "On your birthday? That's beyond cruel. That's psychopathic." "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice breaking. "I have no money, nowhere to go. They've taken everything." "Stay with us," Taylor offered immediately. "My parents would never let you be homeless." That evening, I met with Taylor's parents, who listened with increasing concern as I explained my situation. They exchanged worried glances when I showed them the eviction notice. "Jordan, this doesn't seem right," Mr. Garcia said, examining the document. "If your grandmother left you the house in her will, they can't simply ignore that." "They're saying there was no valid will," I explained, "that all the documents disappeared or weren't properly executed." "Have you spoken to a lawyer?" Mrs. Garcia asked gently. "I can't afford a lawyer. I barely have $500 saved from my part-time job. They've controlled all my grandmother's money since she died. The Garcias offered me their guest room for as long as you need it, a generosity that brought me to tears. That night, I packed essential belongings into 2 suitcases and moved out of my family home, unable to bear another night under the same roof as those who had betrayed me so completely. The relief of having temporary shelter couldn't mask the deep trauma of displacement. I felt untethered, as though the last connection to my parents and grandmother had been severed. Each morning I woke disoriented in the unfamiliar room, momentarily forgetting the cruel reality before it crashed back over me. Finding employment became my immediate priority. Without a college education or specialized skills, my options were severely limited. I applied for every entry-level position I could find, eventually securing a job as a barista at a local coffee shop that barely paid above minimum wage. The hours were long, the work exhausting, and the pay insufficient to afford even the cheapest apartment in Portland. "It's a start," I told myself, coming home with aching feet after 10-hour shifts. "Just keep moving forward." Meanwhile, I drove past my house occasionally, watching with increasing despair as changes began appearing. New curtains in the windows. My grandmother's beloved rose bushes ripped out to make way for a patio extension, a dumpster in the driveway filled with what looked like old furniture, and boxes, probably the last of my family's possessions, being discarded. My mental health deteriorated rapidly. Sleep became elusive, appetite non-existent. I lost weight, developed dark circles under my eyes, and found myself breaking into tears at unpredictable moments. The Garcias watched with growing concern, but didn't know how to help beyond the shelter they had already provided. 2 weeks after moving out, I received a text from Mrs. Lawson, my former neighbor. "They're selling your grandmother's piano. Saw it listed online. Thought you should know. The piano had been my mother's, then my grandmother's, and I had taken lessons on it since childhood." The thought of it being sold to strangers was the breaking point. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching tenant rights and inheritance law at the public library, desperately seeking some legal recourse. The information was overwhelming and confusing. Without proper legal training, I couldn't determine if there were legitimate grounds to challenge the eviction. Most concerning was the discovery that fighting such battles typically required significant financial resources, something I simply didn't have. In a moment of desperation, I called every legal aid society in Portland, explaining my situation to increasingly sympathetic but ultimately unhelpful receptionists. "We have a 6-month waiting list for non-emergency cases," was the typical response, or "we don't handle inheritance disputes, only landlord-tenant issues." One receptionist suggested I try reaching out to law school clinics, where students took on cases under professional supervision. They sometimes take interesting cases for the educational experience, she explained. Your situation is unusual enough that it might qualify. Following this advice led me to the Lewis and Clark Law School Legal Clinic. After explaining my situation 3 times to different people, I was granted a brief consultation with a third-year law student named Marcus, supervised by Professor Elaine Winters. Let me understand correctly, Marcus said, reviewing my notes. You believe your grandmother left you the house in her will, but your uncle claims the will was invalid and now they've evicted you. Yes, I confirmed. They waited until my 18th birthday to do it, when my uncle's guardianship legally ended. Do you have any documentation at all? Copies of the will, letters from your grandmother, anything? I shook my head, feeling hopeless. They controlled everything after she died. The only thing I have is a letter saying her lawyer, Mr. Harrington, had copies of everything. But when I called his office, they said all the files were gone. Professor Winters, who had been listening silently, suddenly looked interested. Harrington, Thomas Harrington from Westside Legal. I nodded. Yes, that's him. Do you know him? He was a colleague before he retired. Very meticulous, very ethical. If he handled your grandmother's will, there would have been multiple copies, proper filing with the probate court. She frowned. The disappearance of all documentation is highly suspicious. For the first time in weeks, I felt a faint glimmer of hope. So you think there might be a way to prove the will existed? Possibly, Professor Winters said carefully. But it would require investigation, and frankly, legal battles like this can be expensive and protracted. Without clear documentation, it becomes your word against your uncle's, and as the current occupant with apparent legal ownership, he has advantages. The hope dimmed as quickly as it had appeared. I can't afford an extended legal battle. I can barely afford to eat right now. Marcus and Professor Winters exchanged glances. Our clinic takes on a limited number of cases pro bono, she said finally. This is complex, but there are educational aspects that would benefit our students. We can't promise anything, but we'll look into it. As I left the clinic that day, I felt marginally better, but still overwhelmed by the enormity of my situation. Even with potential legal help, the road ahead looked impossibly difficult. That night, sitting in the Garcia's guest room, surrounded by the few possessions I had managed to save. From my former life, I reached my lowest point. The inheritance that should have secured my future had been stolen. The family home that contained every memory of my parents and grandmother was being systematically erased and reshaped. The only family I had left had discarded me without remorse once I was no longer legally their responsibility. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, barely recognizing the hollow-eyed, gaunt-faced person staring back. What would Grandma want me to do? I whispered to my reflection. The answer came with surprising clarity. She would want me to fight not just for the house as property, but for the truth and justice she had always taught me to value. She would want me to stand up for myself with the dignity and determination she had modeled throughout her life. In that moment of clarity, something shifted within me. The paralyzing despair began to transform into resolute determination. I might have lost everything materially, but I still had my grandmother's spirit, and I would not dishonor her memory by surrendering to those who had betrayed us both. I pulled out a notebook and began to write, creating a methodical plan for the battle ahead. I might be starting from nothing, but I was no longer without purpose. Uncle Stephen and Diane had taken my home and security, but they couldn't take my will to fight unless I surrendered it, and I was done surrendering. The morning after my moment of clarity, I woke with a sense of purpose that had been absent since receiving the eviction notice. The path forward wouldn't be easy, but having any direction felt infinitely better than drowning in despair. I started by creating a detailed timeline of events from my grandmother's death to the present, noting every suspicious action and conversation I could remember. Marcus from the legal clinic called that afternoon. Professor Winters reached out to some former colleagues of Mr. Harrington, he explained. There's something unusual about how his files were handled after retirement. We're going to keep digging. This small progress fueled my determination. I took on additional shifts at the coffee shop, working open to close whenever possible. Every extra dollar went into a legal fund envelope I kept hidden in the Garcia's guest room. The work was exhausting, but the physical fatigue was easier to bear than the emotional paralysis of victimhood. During my rare breaks, I began researching my grandmother's circle of friends and colleagues, creating a list of people who might have information about her will or financial arrangements. Many were elderly and difficult to locate, but persistence yielded a few connections. My first significant breakthrough came from Mrs. Lawson, who had continued to watch the house with increasing concern. "Jordan, I just remembered something," she said during one of our now regular phone check-ins. "About a month before she passed, your grandmother asked me to witness her signature on some documents. A man in a suit was there, probably her lawyer. She said it was making sure Jordan's future is secure." "Do you remember the lawyer's name?" I asked, heart racing. "Harrington, I think. Yes, because your grandmother introduced him as Mr. Harrington, who's been keeping my legal affairs in order since before Jordan was born." This confirmation that legal documents had definitely existed and been properly witnessed gave me renewed hope. I immediately relayed this information to Marcus, who added it to their growing case file. My next lead came from an unexpected source. While serving coffee to a regular customer at work, I overheard him mention retiring from 40 years of estate planning law. Gathering my courage, I approached him during his next visit and briefly explained my situation. Richard Brennan, the retired attorney, listened with increasing concern. "The disappearance of properly executed legal documents is extremely serious," he said. "Court-filed wills don't simply vanish without malfeasance." When I explained I couldn't afford proper legal representation, he stunned me by offering to review my case pro bono. "I've seen too many young people victimized by opportunistic relatives," he explained. "Consider it my good deed for the month." Under Mr. Brennan's guidance, I filed formal requests with the county probate court for any records related to Margaret Fuller's estate. If a will was properly filed, there should be records even if the original documents are mysteriously lost, he explained. While waiting for these bureaucratic wheels to turn, I continued building my case. Taylor helped me create flyers asking anyone who had information about Margaret Fuller's will to contact me, which we distributed to my grandmother's former colleagues and neighbours. 3 weeks into this process, I received a call that changed everything. Elizabeth Palmer, my grandmother's closest friend, who had been travelling abroad, had just returned to Portland and seen one of our flyers. "Of course, Margaret had a will," she said emphatically when we met at a small cafe. "She was meticulous about such things, especially after your parents died. She was determined to protect you." "My uncle claims there was no valid will," I explained, "that all documentation disappeared or wasn't properly executed." Elizabeth's expression hardened. "That's absolutely false. I was not only a witness to her will, but also the executor of her estate. Or I was supposed to be." "What happened?" "After Margaret died, Stephen contacted me, claiming he had been appointed executor in a more recent will. He had documentation that appeared legitimate, though I was surprised Margaret hadn't mentioned such an important change to me. He said as Jordan's guardian, it made more sense for him to handle everything." My hands began to shake around my coffee cup. There was no new will, was there? "I don't believe so," Elizabeth confirmed. "Margaret and I spoke weekly even during her illness. She would have told me about such a significant change. More importantly, she reached into her purse and extracted a sealed envelope. She gave me this for safekeeping with instructions to give it to you if there were ever any questions about her intentions." The envelope contained a handwritten letter from my grandmother dated just weeks before her death, along with a copy of her will, notarized and witnessed. The will explicitly stated that the house and a modest trust fund were to pass directly to me upon turning 18, with Elizabeth serving as executor until that time. "Stephen knew about this," Elizabeth said, her voice tight with anger. "He not only knew, he actively worked to suppress it." Armed with this concrete evidence, Mr. Brennan helped me file an emergency petition with the probate court and contacted the district attorney's office regarding possible fraud charges. Meanwhile, Professor Winters and her law students uncovered that Mr. Harrington's files had been requested and removed by someone claiming to represent the Fuller family shortly after his retirement. "The signature on the release form doesn't match Elizabeth Palmer's," Marcus explained, showing me the documents they had obtained. "It appears someone forged her signature to gain access to those records." The pieces were falling into place with disturbing clarity. Uncle Stephen and Diane had systematically erased all evidence of my inheritance, going so far as to forge documents and impersonate the legitimate executor of my grandmother's estate. With mounting evidence and multiple legal professionals now involved, I finally felt ready to confront them directly. Mr. Brennan advised against this, suggesting we let the legal process work without tipping our hand, but I insisted on facing them. "They need to know I'm not the helpless child they thought they could discard," I explained. Mr. Brennan reluctantly agreed, but insisted on accompanying me as legal counsel. We arranged the meeting at his office, rather than the house, sending a formal letter requesting Uncle Stephen and Diane's presence to discuss urgent matters related to Margaret Fuller's estate. They arrived looking confident and slightly annoyed at the inconvenience. The moment they saw me sitting beside Mr. Brennan, their expressions shifted to wary confusion. "What is this about?" Uncle Stephen demanded. "We've already settled all matters regarding the estate." "Actually," Mr. Brennan replied smoothly, "we have reason to believe the estate was never properly settled according to Margaret Fuller's legitimate wishes. We have evidence suggesting deliberate suppression of her valid will." He laid out our evidence methodically. The original Will Elizabeth Palmer's testimony, the record of forged documents, and Mrs. Lawson's witness statement. With each new revelation, Uncle Stephen and Diane grew visibly paler. "This is absurd," Uncle Stephen finally sputtered. "These documents could be forged. You have no proof they're legitimate." "The probate court disagrees," Mr. Brennan countered. "They've already initiated an investigation based on the evidence we've submitted. The district attorney is also reviewing potential charges for fraud, forgery, and theft of inheritance." Diane broke her silence with unexpected venom. "You ungrateful child. We gave you a home when no one else would. We could have sent you to foster care." I met her gaze steadily. "My grandmother gave me a home and made legal provisions to ensure I would always have it. You and Uncle Stephen conspired to steal that from me, waiting until my 18th birthday to throw me out onto the street." "We needed that house," she hissed. "Stephen deserved his sister's property after being saddled with you." "The law and my grandmother disagree," I replied, maintaining the calm dignity I had learned from the woman who raised me. "And now you'll both face the consequences of your actions." Uncle Stephen, seeing the seriousness of their situation, attempted to backpedal. "Perhaps we can reach some arrangement, a compromise that benefits everyone. The only acceptable outcome, Mr. Brennan stated firmly, is the immediate return of the property to its rightful owner, along with a full accounting of all assets from Margaret Fuller's estate that have been misappropriated." As they left the office defeated and facing serious legal consequences, I felt no triumph, only a profound sadness that family could betray family so completely. But beneath that sadness was a growing sense of justice and the first fragile tendrils of closure. The legal process moved forward with surprising speed once the evidence was presented. The probate court invalidated all documents submitted by Uncle Stephen and recognised the original will as binding. The house was legally returned to my ownership, and a full accounting of the trust fund my grandmother had established was ordered. When the day came to reclaim my home, Mr. Brennan accompanied me along with a sheriff's deputy to ensure a peaceful transition. Uncle Stephen, Diane, and their children were in the process of moving out loading boxes into a rented truck under the watchful eyes of neighbours who had quietly supported me throughout the ordeal. As I stood on the sidewalk, watching them remove their possessions from my home, Uncle Stephen approached me one last time. "You've destroyed this family," he said bitterly. "Your grandmother would be ashamed." I looked at him calmly, no longer afraid or intimidated. "My grandmother taught me that family doesn't steal from family and that justice matters more than convenience. I think she would be proud that I fought for what was right, even when it was difficult." As they drove away from the house that had never rightfully been theirs, I turned toward the home that had always been meant to be mine. It would need healing just as I did, but we would rebuild together, preserving the legacy my grandmother had fought so hard to secure for me. Standing on the porch of my reclaimed home, key in hand, I experienced a complex mixture of emotions. The victory felt hollow in some ways, tainted by the betrayal that had necessitated the fight in the first place. The house, once filled with warmth and love under my grandmother's care, now felt eerily empty, as though the months of occupation by Uncle Stephen's family had stripped away its soul. Mr. Brennan squeezed my shoulder gently. "Take your time," he advised. "Reclaiming a space is both physical and emotional work." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior had been transformed during their occupation, painted in colours my grandmother would have hated, family photos replaced with their own furniture, rearranged to erase any trace of our family's history. "They've changed everything," I whispered, moving from room to room in a daze. Mrs. Lawson appeared at the still open front door, holding a box. "I saved some things," she said hesitantly. When I saw them throwing out photographs and keepsakes, I retrieved what I could. The box contained family photos my grandmother had displayed proudly, several of her handmade quilts that had been relegated to the attic, and small mementos that held no monetary value but were priceless in terms of memory and connection. "Thank you." I managed tears, finally breaking free. "You've saved pieces of my history." The physical restoration of the house became my therapy in those first weeks. I worked methodically, room by room, stripping away the changes Uncle Stephen and Diane had made, repainting walls in the warm colours my grandmother had chosen, and reclaiming spaces with furniture, rescued from storage, or purchased secondhand to replace what had been sold or discarded. Taylor and her parents helped enormously, spending weekends painting and cleaning. Mrs. Lawson connected me with other neighbours who had known my grandmother, many of whom contributed time furniture or simply stories that helped restore the emotional fabric of the home. Elizabeth Palmer, now formally reinstated as the executor of my grandmother's estate until I reached 21, helped me navigate the financial aspects of home ownership and the recovered trust fund. The fund, though significantly depleted by Uncle Stephen's mismanagement, still contained enough to cover property taxes and basic maintenance while I established myself. Your grandmother wanted this to support your education, Elizabeth explained as we reviewed the accounts. She believed education was the foundation of independence. With financial pressures somewhat eased, I enrolled in community college part-time while continuing to work at the coffee shop. The flexible schedule allowed me to balance education work and the ongoing restoration of both my home and my sense of security. The legal consequences for Uncle Stephen and Diane unfolded gradually. They faced civil penalties for the misappropriation of assets, and the district attorney pursued criminal charges for fraud and forgery. The process was painful, requiring me to testify about the betrayal and its impact on my life. Each court appearance reopened wounds that were still raw, but I drew strength from my grandmother's memory and the justice being served. Reclaiming my physical and emotional equilibrium proved more challenging than I had anticipated. Nightmares frequently disrupted my sleep, often featuring scenarios where I returned home to find it taken again or transformed beyond recognition. During waking hours, I struggled with hypervigilance, constantly checking locks and boundaries as though expecting another invasion. Dr. Levine, a therapist I began seeing through a program for victims of family trauma, helped me understand these reactions as normal responses to profound betrayal. When those who should protect you cause harm, instead, it disrupts your fundamental sense of safety, she explained. Healing requires rebuilding that sense of safety from the ground up. Under her guidance, I began developing healthier coping mechanisms and establishing new routines that reinforced my ownership of both my space and my future. Simple rituals like morning coffee in my grandmother's favorite chair or gardening in the beds we had tended together became anchors in my healing process. 6 months after reclaiming my home, I received an unexpected letter from Tyler, my former step-cousin. Unlike the rest of his family, he expressed genuine remorse for his role in what had happened. I knew what they were doing was wrong, he wrote, but I was too cowardly to speak up. I've been carrying that guilt since we left. His acknowledgement of wrongdoing, while not erasing the harm done, provided a strange comfort. It confirmed that my perception of events had been accurate, and that the moral failure lay with them, not me. As the 1-year anniversary of my 18th birthday approached, I decided to reclaim that date, with a gesture that honoured my grandmother's legacy. With Elizabeth's help, I established a small foundation called Margaret's Promise, dedicated to providing legal assistance to young people facing similar situations of family financial abuse or inheritance theft. Many young people don't have the resources or knowledge to fight for what's legally theirs, I explained at the small launch gathering held in my restored living room. This foundation will help ensure they aren't left vulnerable as I was. The foundation began modestly funded by a portion of my trust and contributions from those who had witnessed my journey. Professor Winters and her law students agreed to provide pro bono services through the clinic, while Mr. Brennan served as legal advisor. It gave purpose to my pain, transforming a personal tragedy into a source of support for others. Throughout this period of rebuilding, I struggled with questions about forgiveness. Dr. Levine helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't a single decision, but a process, and that it needed to serve my healing rather than excuse those who had harmed me. Forgiveness doesn't mean allowing harmful people back into your life, she emphasized. It means releasing the power they have over your peace of mind. With this perspective, I began working toward a forgiveness that was about freeing myself rather than absolving Uncle Stephen and Diane. I didn't want bitterness to define my future or dictate my capacity for trust and connection. As my home physically transformed back into a space of comfort and safety, I gradually expanded my definition of family beyond blood relations. Taylor and her parents, who had sheltered me in my darkest moment, became family by choice. Elizabeth, who had honoured her promise to my grandmother despite obstacles, became a mentor and surrogate grandmother figure. Even Mr. Brennan and Professor Winters, who had fought for justice alongside me, became part of my expanding circle of chosen family. One unexpected outcome of this difficult journey was a new clarity about my educational and career path. My experiences navigating the legal system and witnessing the power of knowledgeable advocates had sparked an interest in law, particularly areas protecting vulnerable individuals from exploitation. With encouragement from Professor Winters, I began tailoring my studies toward eventually applying to law school. You have the first-hand experience and emotional intelligence that makes for truly effective advocacy, she told me when I shared my tentative plan. Your grandmother would be incredibly proud of how you're transforming adversity into purpose. The restoration of my grandmother's garden became a metaphor for my overall healing. Many of her beloved plants had been removed or neglected during Uncle Stephen's occupation, but with careful attention and patience, I began bringing it back to life. Mrs. Lawson, an experienced gardener, helped me identify which plants might recover with care and which needed to be replaced. Gardens are resilient, she observed as we worked together one spring morning. Even when they appear destroyed, there's often life waiting just beneath the surface, ready to emerge when conditions improve. The same proved true for my capacity to trust and connect. Though deeply wounded by familial betrayal, I gradually opened myself to new relationships, approaching them with greater discernment, but not with paralyzing suspicion. I learned to recognize the difference between healthy caution and trauma-driven fear, between setting boundaries and building walls. 2 years after reclaiming my home, I hosted a gathering to mark what would have been my grandmother's 75th birthday. The house was once again filled with warmth, laughter, and people who genuinely cared for one another. Looking around at this assembled chosen family, I felt my grandmother's presence more strongly than I had since her passing. That evening, sitting alone in the garden after everyone had left, I reflected on the journey from that devastating 18th birthday to the present. The path had been neither straight nor easy, marked by setbacks and moments of despair alongside victories and growth. The house around me was no longer just a structure I had fought to reclaim, but a home I had consciously rebuilt, incorporating elements of my grandmother's legacy while making space for my own emerging identity. It represented not just what I had managed to save from the past, but what I was actively creating for my future. The betrayal by Uncle Stephen and Diane had taught me harsh lessons about human nature and the complex dynamics of family, but it had also revealed unexpected strengths within myself and connections with others that might never have developed under less challenging circumstances. Most importantly, I had discovered that home wasn't just about physical property or legal ownership. It was about creating a space where one's authentic self could exist safely, surrounded by genuine connections, rather than obligatory biological ties. My grandmother had tried to secure my future through material provisions, but her most valuable legacy had been the resilience and values she instilled in me. As night fell, I made a silent promise to honor that legacy, not just by preserving what she had built, but by extending it forward, creating ripples of positive impact through Margaret's promise and my own evolving path. The house that had almost been stolen from me had become more than a dwelling. It was the foundation from which I would build a life that would have made my grandmother proud. Have you ever had to redefine what family means to you after someone you trusted let you down? How did you rebuild your sense of home and belonging? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If this journey of reclaiming what was rightfully mine resonated with you, please like and subscribe to support more stories about finding strength in difficult times. Don't forget to share with someone who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggle to create a safe place to call home. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the family we choose proves stronger than the family we're born into.